Hello and welcome to Religion and Praxis. Our podcast finished this year with a very, very exciting episode, book, Putinism, Post-Soviet Russian Regime Ideology, written by Professor Mikhail Suslov, who is a professor at the Copenhagen University and the leading voice for many of us reading about Russian history and politics, a renowned author whose interests focuses on the evolution of liberal ideologies in non-Western context. His work extensively examines the Russian right-wing, geopolitical, church-related concepts, visions, and utopias, mostly interested in intellectual development of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet political philosophy. And Professor Suslov's current research aims mostly to understand the essence, role, and intellectual roots of Putinism as a new competitor to liberal democracy, an ideology with considerable international appeal and potential to resonate with many other ideologies such as populism, right-wing communitarianism, traditionalist anti-globalism, religious fundamentalism, and so on. Professor Suslov's recent publications include co-edited volumes, Contemporary Russian Conservatism, Problems, Paradoxes, and Dangers, The Post-Soviet Politics of Utopia, Language, Fiction, and Fantasy in Russia, Pan-Slavism and Slavophilia in Contemporary Central and Eastern Europe, and monograph Geopolitical Imaginations, Ideology and Utopia in Post-Soviet Russia, as well as the recent one, the most recent one, which we will be today discussing Putinism, Post-Soviet Russian Regime Ideology. And we are very happy to have you here today. We're honored that we're looking forward to this talk. Professor Suslov, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Torinke, for inviting me. That's my great pleasure and honor.
Great. And let's get directly to the questions. So let's bring a broader set of fundamental sort of framework. What is Putinism about? If we have to just pin it down to for a simple audience, what is the Putinism concept about?
Yeah, I tried to pinpoint the essence of Putinism as a response to the problem of imitation in the process of westernization. This problem was humiliating for so many Russians, but not only Russians, think about Poland or Hungary as well. And the failure of transition in the 90s could be accounted for this sense of humiliation and the lack of personal agency when you think that the best thing which you can possibly do is to repeat somebody else's past and previous stages of development. Think that for millions of Russians, the possible future in 20 years from now would be to become like second Denmark 50 years before. And when you think about it in this way, it takes away the joy of life. It kills the purpose of life. So I think that Putinism is appealing to so many Russians precisely because it says that, no, actually, Russia has its own path. It is not just repeating the Western guidelines, and that this special path is somehow relevant to the whole world. So here we are back to our familiar old messianism.
And is it primarily a response to perceived external threats or internal search for national identity and unity?
I think both, but primarily this is definitely in the line of searching for Russia's new identity after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because Russia specifically faced quite serious problems on the way of understanding and reinterpreting its own past. Because you can speak about three possible models on how you can deal with traumatic, problemsome past in history. The first is the way how post-Soviet republics dealt with that. So this is the narrative of liberation. And this is very straightforward, perhaps sometimes oversimplifying, but it is straightforward and appealing. Basically, it tells you the story that the country was fighting for its liberation, and then it finally became free, and everyone lived happily ever after. But it doesn't work with Russia because, there were modest attempts to say that Russia was subjugated by the Soviet Union, and then in 1991 Russia liberated itself from the Soviet Union. But for so many Russians, Soviet Union and Russia were synonyms, so this way was closed, basically. It was not so attractive for people to believe that they got liberated from what? From themselves. So the second way is the German way, which requires the total overhaul, total reconsideration of your identity and previous past, and rejection of your previous past. I'm talking about the way how Germany coped with its Nazi past. And this way was also closed for Russia for... Of course, the Soviet Union was the period of uncountable huge sufferings of so many people, but simultaneously the Soviet Union was also the period of so important accomplishments. I'm talking about the victory during the Second World War, for example, technological breakthrough. Then just look at statistics. The Soviet GDP share in the world GDP was almost 10%, the highest which Russia ever achieved in its 1,000 years history. Today's Russian GDP share is less than 2%. So whenever you are talking about all these crimes of Stalinism, Gulag, and so on and so forth, there would be a person who would say, but what about Gagarin? Or what about the victory after the Second World War? Or what about Russian Soviet technological? This is part of the Soviet past, and it will always be part of the Soviet past. So you can't actually get rid of the Soviet past in an easy way. So you have to find a different way how to reconstruct your identity. And this way is similar more or less to how post-Frankist Spain is dealing with the past, which is partially sending this past into the shadow, partially criticizing it, partially accepting it, but in a more dramatic way.
I wonder how significant is the influence of the Orthodox Church on Putinism, particularly in shaping its core values and messianic narratives. I wonder also on the I mean, there have been debates, and I was involved in some of them. The role and the agency of the church in the international affairs. Many people are, to my personal feeling, are reducing the role of the church to the instrumental function. So basically, it's just the instrument of the regime. Basically, the main pillar is the state, but the church is somewhat in the background. I often argue with this crew that, well, there is a lot the church actually offers, and I believe one of the most demonstrable offerings is this kind of messianic narrative about the core values and its sort of vision and division of society, but also the civilizationism, Christian civilizationism, whether one calls it Holy Rus or Russian world, whatnot, but this idea of this macro category that is creating the past with the future and the mission of the nation. Yet again, that is sort of that doesn't necessarily argues against the realist interpretations of Russia's foreign policy, but it kind of complements it, I think. But but my question would be, how significant is the influence of the church?
Yeah. Well, in this debate, I'm rather on the side of those who say that the influence of the church should not be exaggerated. I'm not saying that the church is completely instrumental, just part of the toolkit of the Russian political regime to solve its ad hoc problems. I think that the impact is long-lasting and quite fundamental, but I think that the church, especially in the last 10 years or so, is becoming a liability rather than asset of the regime. for one simple reason, because the religious values are not being bought by the Russian society. They're not popular. So if you look at the statistics, you have quite few Russians who stand for the ban of abortions, for example, only 2%. Very few people embrace all these talks of the church about traditional values, morality, faith in God, and so on and so forth. And when you have such a thoroughly secularized population, then the church is becoming a hindrance, an obstacle to creating a successful ideology than a helping hand. But it was not always like that. I think this is how things are right now. But previously, especially I'm talking about the period 2009, 2014 approximately, this was the period when the church and the state were looking eye to eye, basically. The influence was not unidirectional. It was not like the state was just accepting what the church is telling it. It was rather, they were rather moving on the parallel tracks in constant negotiation and dialogue. So when you look at some specific ideological components of Putinism, such as Russian world or the concept of basic values, then they emerged more or less simultaneously in the secular and in the religious milieus. And then they were discussed among them, among these two parties. So let's take as an example the concept of basic values, which was suggested by Petr Kirill in 2009. And the idea basically meant that there is a civilization, which is Russian civilization, and this civilization has a set of values which is radically different from a set of values of some other civilizations, like Western civilization. So this was a radical negation of Western universalism. So as it is written in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, it is assumed that all people value three things: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the Russian church, and together with the church, the Russian political rulers, they were emphatically against that. They believed that, and continue to believe that, there is a special value, special set of values for Russia, special set of values for Chinese, special set of values for the Arab world, special set of values for the Latin America, and so on and so forth. And this assumption was embodied in the concept of basic values. But then these basic values were debated also in the so-called state patriotic club of the United Russia Party. United Russia Party was and is the ruling party, the most important party in Russia. And it was debated inside this party, and all these talks about basic values found their way to the highest level, including presidential administration and president himself. So it was not, it doesn't look like the presidential administration simply copied what the church said. It looks like these ideas were hovering somewhere in the air, and they were debated relatively independently in the church and in the secular milieus.
Yeah, let me just maybe rephrase the somewhat the question that I wanted to ask next. But let's say we buy the argument that the church's role is overestimated and maybe oversold by some scholars as the major factor. But to understand Putinism well, we need to understand probably how Putinism is interested in cracking the system and using different sort of ideologies which are out there, and then pitching the one which is relevant to the context at the time when it's relevant for its own agenda. So basically, there is this Russian world or religious conservatism, and at the time when it becomes relevant, the issues get instrumentalized. Which issues, which values, which aspects, when, this is depending on the context. But the church is like the state is a primary voice. If we buy that, then the question is, and another kind of assumption, that Russian regime, to my understanding, pretty much relies on the crisis. They need to be having the crisis which they handle. But the crisis has never had to get out of control. It has to be controlled crisis, and the state has to be the handler of the crisis.
Yeah.
But the church provides this mythology, which this abstract, as well as other agencies, as well as other actors, nationalists and other realists perhaps. But the church gives that constantly because of its canonical territoriality concept and vague moral and basic concepts which are easily to interpret. And because they are so vague and easily to ambiguous to interpret, the state, whenever it decides to, uses that for hijacking the religious agenda in a way. Do you find that convincing or not?
Yes, more or less, with one reservation, one caveat. I think that the degree of flexibility of the regime ideology is exaggerated in the literature as well. I think that Marlene Leroy, the former scholar of Russian political regime and ideology, suggested the metaphor of a jazz band, ideology like a jazz band, when all musicians are playing their own tune within one kind of general concept. I think I would suggest a different, perhaps stronger metaphor. It's like the salad bowl, where you can put different ingredients. But if you want to produce a particular kind of salad, say Caesar salad, then you can't add something which does not pass. Like you can't add herring in the Caesar salad. So the same is with the ideology of Putinism. There are some things which are absolutely idiosyncratic and unthinkable and incommensurable to Putinism, such as liberal values, liberalism in general. So there is a kind of rigid grid of principles on which the whole edifice of Putinism is constructed. So it's not totally flexible on the side of the regime just to cherry pick whatever ideas they want. They can cherry pick only particular ideas.
And how does Putinism compare with previous Russian ideologies in its approach to nationalism and religion and state power? Is there any compelling difference?
Yeah, I can identify both differences and similarities. So we are talking about three waves or three different kinds of Russian official ideologies. The first is the so-called triad. This is the concept which was suggested by the Minister of Education Uvarov in the middle of 19th century. And quite interestingly, that in November this year, a statue of Uvarov was inaugurated in St. Petersburg. And the triad basically means three principles: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Then you have Marxism-Leninism during the Soviet period, and now, as I claim, you have the third Russian official ideology, which is Putinism. And they all are similar in the way how the state's role is defined. The state is defined as an agency which protects the area from the external aggression. So you have also the component of anti-Westernism inscribed in all three ideologies. And then the state is responsible for setting the path, setting the step, or identifying the development stages for the country. I think, however, the differences are perhaps more important than similarities. Unlike two other official ideologies, Putinism lacks a clear utopian vision or the end goal. This is obvious that for triad, for the 19th century, the end goal was identified by the Orthodox faith. For Marxism-Leninism, the end goal was Marxist utopia of communist future. And for contemporary Russian political ideology, what is the end goal? It is defined negatively. The end goal is destruction of the Western hegemony, basically. But so what? What comes after that? It's not clear.
So that's the actual utopian vision, you think?
Yeah, it's the actual utopian vision, but it is a thin or shallow utopian vision because it's defined negatively. So there is no positive content in it. The end goal for Putinism is to destroy Western hegemony and to let all civilizations blossom in their own way. But what is the end goal for the human civilization or for one particular civilization is not clear.
It's a kind of a, I mean, we're talking about the basic values concept. It's kind of a Russian rebuke to Huntington, right? In a way, it's a kind of a Russian version of Clashes of Civilizations. You know?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, Huntington was tremendously important for Russian political elite and for Russian intellectual debates in the 90s and later on. Huntington put on the basis of other thinkers such as Nikolai Danilevsky, for example, or Toynbee, produced a very powerful thrust towards reinterpreting history in civilizational terms. And it is consequential because before that, you have this arrow-like understanding of history with some end goal in sight, like communism, for example. And now it's no longer the arrow, it's like it's a lake, and the boat is sailing on the lake in all possible directions. The only goal for your boat is not to capsize, it's just to sail, keep yourself afloat. If you remember the famous saying from 2010s, don't rock the boat. So you can identify the essence of Putinist ideology as don't rock the boatism. So just keeping the boat afloat without the vision of where this boat should sail.
And this is incredibly important, I think, for generally understanding the facets of Putinism. How well does Putinism resonate with the general Russian population and the intellectual elite? Does it truly reflect their concerns and aspirations?
I think yes. I think it reflects both the aspirations of the elites and the general population. I can judge about that by looking at the behavior of the elites, especially after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Very few defectors you have, actually. Very few defectors from the Russian political elite to a different camp, very few dissenters. So it looks like Putinism really resonated within the Russian political elite, where I can't see any meaningful cleavage or dissidence so far. But perhaps even more consequential is to talk about the Russian population. It is important, especially in the context of the war. So if you look at statistics, how many people support the war, and the figure is quite large, it's more than 70%. But what is more important is the support is in the reverse correspondence to the educational level. I mean, so the more educated you are.
We had the problem with the voice, I think. So can you repeat from the part, the support, we lost your voice.
Yeah, so to repeat about the population's response to Putinism. Yeah, so I mean that we can tease out some interesting information when we look at the support of the war. And the figure is large enough, it's more than 70%, but what is more important is that the support of the war is in the reverse correspondence to the educational level, meaning that the more educated a Russian is, the more likely it is that he or she would support the war, which is counterintuitive. You could probably expect that it is the other way around, but no. And it requires an explanation, and my explanation is that you can't explain Putinism by the power of propaganda. Actually, I'm on this side of the debates about propaganda, that propaganda is never a unidirectional thrust of ideas. It's not just you consume the propaganda and become indoctrinated. I think that people always retain their agency in choosing which ideas they believe in and which they don't. So Putinism is not just about propaganda, it's about the deeper resonance with people's political values. And here I'm talking specifically about such values as strong hand, justice. So these, according to statistics which I have at my disposal, there are two largest political values to which the vast majority of Russians subscribe. Strong hand or strong power, imperial prestige and so on, and justice. And Putinism provides both. So when you put these two groups of people, for justice and for strong hand, then it gives you approximately the Putinists' constituency 70% plus. However, I claim that there is an alternative to that. And Putinism is really very popular, but it's not the fate of the Russian people. There could be a different constituency, political constituency. I'm talking about two values. One is, again, justice, and another is self-development and human rights. And statistics show that around 40% of Russians actually value self-development and human rights, just like in the normal Western country. So when you combine these two values, justice and human rights, you will get the political party of social democrats, just like in Scandinavia. The problem with Russia is that they don't have the party of social democracy. Perhaps you can look into the direction of Communist Party of Russian Federation, but with all their nationalist extravaganza, it definitely is not a good voice of social democracy. So, responding to the question, what if not Putin, then my response would be, it is social democracy.
Why does it not work? Why nobody's created the party?
Yeah, well, because of the nature of authoritarian regime, it destroyed all possibilities. So the actual competitor to Putin was not Navalny, were not liberal or nationalist leaders, but the actual competitor to Putin was always a hypothetical social democratic leader, perhaps Zyuganov. But Zyuganov was definitely bought by the regime a long time ago, and the poisonous sting was taken away from Zyuganov in this sense.
It's interesting that you mentioned the more educated, the more supportive of the war. How do you explain it sociologically? Like, what is at the stake? Like, one might say, well, there's a lot linked to the social capital and kind of the interests of the elites, that they're so ingrained in the system that they're the ones accessing the network, they're the ones beneficiaries, so they want the war continue, not to get the status challenged. But what will be the, other explanation?
Yeah, difficult to say. I'm not a sociologist, but I have my hypothesis. So if you look at this dynamics, then the more educated you are, the more likely you support the war. But then if you are very educated and if you work in science, then the support of war drops precipitously. So only 8% of people who work in academia support the war in Russia, according to statistics which I have, and this is mostly Levada surveys. So my interpretation is simple. I think that the level of education reflects the level of well-being, and the more dispossessed or economically miserable people are, the less likely that they would subscribe to Putinism, because simply they kind of combine the economic dissatisfaction with political dissatisfaction. We have some evidence behind that, because another survey shows you that the more well-off you are, the richer you are, the more likely you are to support the war as well. So again, you have the same basic assumption or hypothesis when you look at this table, is that rich people simply can relate to Putinism in a better way, because Putinism gave them their material well-being.
But if we look at the well-being, if majority of the Russians are not well off, that's the fact. And yet many scholars say that, well, Putin appeals to the ordinary people, that what keeps him in power. But as far as I understand, you're saying that it's not as easy as it seems, because Putin appeals to different groups with different interests. So it actually appeals to the political nationalist agenda, to the groups which are into nationalism, appeals to the elites with their own network and protection. So that is way more adaptable and multifaceted, right?
Oh, definitely so. Yeah, I mean, Putinism is a very clever tool to keep in power. It can definitely speak to so many groups of people, including relatively rich people, relatively poor people, but mostly to the people who don't have the dissatisfaction about the regime. So people who could be defined as middle-class Russian style. So speaking about the well-being of Russians, this is the relative phenomenon, of course. So the claim that the majority of Russians are not well off it requires consideration in relation to what? So if you compare Russian economic well-being right now with the past in Russia, then actually Russia has never lived as good as it is now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm saying that, well, the poverty, some basic measures which are correlated with the general well-being, the levels of education, the healthcare, access to healthcare, etc. So those stats, of course, compared to what, but it is not evidential that the people live well off under Putinism, right?
Yeah, well, again, I'm not an economist. To the best of my knowledge, the economic growth in terms of GDP is more or less stopped after the crisis 2008. So Russian GDP did not change much in the past 15 years or so. In this sense, yes, Putinism is, of course, not conducive for economic growth. On the other hand, if you look at the history in the short-term perspective, for example, when we are talking about the war in Ukraine, then with all these massive social pains, the Putinist regime is actually creating well-being for the most dispossessed people.
I think it also brings an interesting question about the nature of Putinism. So one might wonder how Putinism is different from, populism, populist authoritarianism, whatnot. I mean, there's so many frameworks out there, but is Putinism an effective cognitive prism for Russian population, providing them with a meaningful interpretation of their place in the world and current global dynamics, or is it yet another form of populism? What is it exactly? How can we pin it down?
Well, first and foremost, yes, Putinism is a form of populism. As I claim in the book, Putinism could be described as an ideology by referring to three ideologies. This is populism, right-wing or identitarian conservatism, and communitarianism. So yes, it's definitely a form of populism. When you are asking about the cognitive prism, whether Putinism is an effective cognitive prism, so we have to understand that this is a question which is different from the question whether Putinism resonates with the population or the elite. Yes, it does. But is it an effective cognitive prism towards making my value judgment? Because it's not an empirical thing. It's kind of something related to political and moral philosophy. I think that communitarianism on which Putinism is grounded is wrong all the way through. So I think that it gives Putinism the wrong prism to look at the world. Let me be specific. I think that what characterizes communitarianism is exactly this belief that you don't have universal values, that you have several civilizations, and for each civilization you have its separate set of values. And I think this is just factually wrong. When you are talking about the wrongness of an ideology, you can look at two levels. It could be wrong on its own premises, and it could be wrong by its consequences. So when we are talking about Nazi Germany, for example, then Nazism is wrong on its own premises because it assumes that you have the race of masters, the race of slaves, that you have to create Lebensraum on the east by decimating the local population and so on. So it is man-hating, it is ugly, morally ugly ideology on its own premises. When you look at Marxism, for example, then there is nothing morally ugly in its basic premises, but it led to so huge human losses during the 20th century. So these human losses prejudice the soundness of Marxism by its consequences. I think Putinism is on the same level as Marxism in this sense. There is nothing intrinsically sinister or evil in Putinism itself. But I think that when you look at what Putinism brought to Russia, first and foremost, and to Russia's neighbors, then my assumption would be that it is terribly wrong on the way how it looks on the world.
It's interesting, the adaptability part of Putinism. Given Putinism's apparent adaptability, how might it evolve in response to domestic and international challenges? What are possible directions it might take?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the obvious point of growth for Putinism is to play with the concept of justice and to step into the domain of left-wing agenda. So this is what is happening in the past couple of years, actually, when Putin himself and his henchmen, they relate explicitly to the idea of social justice, geopolitical justice, anti-colonialism in quite paradoxical way. And also, if you factor in the possibility of Russia's rapprochement with China and perhaps some strategic partnership with the Communist Party of China, then I think that there is a possibility for Putinism to tap into socialism and to create this convergence, right-wing convergence, which was called in the 90s red-brown opposition. So in our case, we can talk about this international coalition of traditionalist and leftist regimes. And if this happens, then Putinism and Putin's Russia has a good chance to become the leader of this coalition.
Interesting. Are there inherent? I mean, we mentioned a few contradictions, and I was fortunate to read the book, so I did a lot of interesting content. I highly recommend our listeners to get the book SAP and read. If you want to understand Putinism, that's the book to go. Are there inherent contradictions within Putinism that might limit its longevity or effectiveness as a guiding ideology for Russia?
Yeah, on more general and abstract level, the contradiction of Putinism is between its universalism and particularism. On the one hand, it claims to be a universal ideology, but its universalism boils down to the statement that there should be no universalism in the world. Yeah, so it says all civilizations should blossom in their own way, no universalism. And this claim, no universalism, is universal, which created this intrinsic, internal paradox. But then when we look in more specific cases, a huge paradox is connected with the key concept of Putinism, which is sovereignty. So the central premise of Putinism is that civilization should be sovereign, meaning independent, like an adult person. In liberalism, civilization is like this adult rational personality which should take its own decision. But then what to do with Ukraine, for example? So they claim that Russian civilization is sovereign, but then Ukraine is not sovereign. So who decides which part of the world is sovereign and which part is not sovereign? And if they say that Ukraine has no rights to be sovereign, then maybe you can also claim that Russia is also just part of Western civilization and should not be sovereign. So this is one of these paradoxes. Another paradox, it relates to the problem of isolationism. Putinism has a natural tendency towards isolationism, and you can see it on various planes of interpretation in various contexts. For example, relatively recently, Dmitry Peskov, not the press secretary, but the special representative of President Putin in issues of technology. He wrote the article which is called "The Island Russia," and he claimed that Russia should attain technological sovereignty. Some other intellectuals, like Mezhuev, for example, they claim that Russia should gain civilizational indifference. So, whatever the case, the bottom line is that many intellectuals are talking about the need for Russia to disengage from the world. But in order to disengage from the world effectively, you have to have a self-sufficient economy. So you can claim that in order to gain this self-sufficiency, you have to get a better access to the sea, or you have to get a better access to some part of infrastructure. So basically you say that in order to become isolated, you have to expand fast, first and foremost, to annex part of Ukraine, for example. So this is another internal paradox of Putinism. Then we are talking about justice. As I mentioned, it's a big concept right now. And Putinism is expanding a lot on geopolitical justice, fighting against neo-colonialism, as they call it. But then what about social justice? So it is pretty obvious that both in Russia internally and internationally, you have huge discrepancy between the rich and the poor. But how Russia is going to solve this problem? So the problem of injustice is global, but then Russia denies, Putinist Russia denies this global framework. It argues that you should talk about several civilizations. So it addresses the problem which it a priori cannot solve. So yeah, these are just a few examples which
that's extremely interesting and very thoughtful to just mention that particular controversy in the light of Ukrainian war, and that gives me the possibility to ask a question about the invasion of Ukraine. How can we explain why Putinism needed the Ukrainian invasion? What was the rationale? What's your theory?
Well, two considerations in relation to war in Ukraine. First, I saw the war coming before the war actually happened, and I saw it in ideology, because ideology provided for the need for a fundamental confrontation with the West. So it was several years before the war actually started that it became clear that Putinism requires this sort of final confrontation with the West as the way how Russia can fulfill its own messianic purpose. Because Russian messianic purpose, as it is described by major ideologists of the regime, is to stop the West. To destroy the Western hegemony, basically. So this is the universal liberatory mission, as Putin is described it. But when it comes to Ukraine specifically, I'm not a military specialist, so I presume that the decision to go to war was perhaps somewhat contingent, accidentally adopted. But it is also true that the idea that Ukraine has no own sovereignty, that Ukraine is just part of Russia, was explicitly prescribed in Putin's article from summer 21, and just several months after that the war actually started. My kind of educated guess is that had Putin known the actual consequences, he would have refrained from starting the war in the form which it actually took. But that the element of confrontation with the West was deeply ingrained in ideology is obvious for me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to go back to the questions of the church a little bit, and especially we briefly mentioned the basis of social doctrine. What are the key tenets of the basis of social doctrine, and how do they influence the church's role in society?
Yeah, it should be understood that the basis of the social doctrine, adopted in 2000, reflected this time. And this time was the time when the church believed that it can change the rule of the game. So, well, in order to explain my point, I need to introduce the concept of post-secularism in a brief way. So, post-secular situation is the situation in which we live now, is when the church has to compete with other providers of leisure time, like you decide whether to go to the church or to the theater or to cinema or to sit with your friends or to go to restaurants, so on and so forth. So the church can have its place in society, but it has to compete with other forms and other actors. But the Russian Orthodox Church wanted actually to roll history back to the time when it decided the rules of the game, when you don't have the option whether to go to the church on Sunday or not. You have to. When you don't have the option whether to have religious instruction in school or not, you have to. And this enthusiastic approach to the church possibility was characteristic of the period around 2000, because this was the period when you have a huge constituency of Russian people who identified themselves as the Orthodox, but then you have just few people who, small fraction of the population who actually go to the church, who actually attend the most important religious services, liturgy, for example, who participate in the life of their parish. So this discrepancy between 70+% of those who are Orthodox and 2-3% of actual churchgoers gave the impression that as time goes on, then the number of actual churchgoers would grow up to this figure, the higher estimate, 70-something%. But it never happened. So today, after 23 years after the adoption of this basis of the social, we can understand that those promises that the church would churchize, they use this word, churchize the world, the Russian society, it didn't actually happen. So yeah, the basis was filled with this promise, this hope, but it didn't come true.
And despite the constitutional principle of the church-state separation, how has the Russian church positioned itself with respect to social values and moral judgments?
They definitely wanted to become the ultimate instance of the moral judgment on all important issues. And this is prescribed exactly in the basis of the social doctrine. It actually reflects on this idea that the church should set up its own rules of the game, that all morally important issues in society should be the business of the church. But again, there is a huge discrepancy between what they actually wanted and what is actually happening in society. So you can see this discrepancy in so many contexts and examples. So take abortion, for example. So the church is quite emphatic against the abortion, but then abortions are not only free, not only legal, but also free of charge for Russians. Russian legislation in relation to abortion is one of the most liberal in the world so far. If you take, for example, the presence of God in Constitution, you know, the amended Constitution 2020, it mentions God, but it mentions God in a very oblique way, indirect way. It's not like in Hungarian Constitution where it says that Hungarian people is united by tradition and God. So Hungarian Constitution sort of postulates that God exists. But the Russian Constitution says literally this, that Russian Federation observes or venerates forefathers who passed on their tradition and believe in God to us. So the Russian Constitution, it basically says that we venerate the tradition of believing in God, not God himself, right? So it does not postulate the existence of God, it postulates the existence of tradition of believing in God. So you can please both sides. You can please the religious people and say, well, you have God and Constitution. But you can also please agnostics, atheists. You can say, well, but we do not postulate that God exists. Take other contexts like the army, for example, or the school. So again, you have this attempt of the church to be relevant, to be present in society, like, for example, in the army. And it is present in the army. But according to the official data, in the Russian army, you have slightly more than 300 priests or chaplains, military priests. The Russian army before the beginning of the war was around 1 million people. And this is only soldiers, not counting all this supplementary personnel. So it means that you have one priest for 3,300 soldiers. So in practice, it means that, well, very rarely when a soldier has a chance even to talk to a priest. Then if you look at you probably know that there is a special political department in the Ministry of the Defense. This is the heir to the Soviet Glavpur, the main department for political propaganda. So yeah, you have basically this department of political propaganda in today's Russian army as well. But when you go to their website and look into the list of films which they advise that the officers would show to the soldiers, You have all these canonical Soviet wartime films about the war and post-Soviet films about the war, and not a single film about religion. So I think that when it comes to the army, then the army leadership still relies on the old Soviet style of indoctrinating, or maybe telling the right story about politics and history, rather than outsourcing this propaganda task to the church.
Yeah. And before we finish, and we're 6 minutes away from our guillotine, what are the common exaggerations and misconceptions about the Russian Orthodox Church's role in shaping the regime's ideology?
Yeah. I think that the common misunderstanding and misinterpretation is to represent the church as a boogeyman, the strong and omnipotent and aggressive agency. I think that its role should be assessed realistically. It should be assessed realistically and in historical perspective. So we can talk about the importance of the church in the previous decades, but now things are changing. For example, if you follow what Putin is saying, in the last year, for example, he referred to Alexander Zinoviev, thinker, Soviet time thinker and dissident Alexander Zinoviev, and he was an atheist. So this is quite unexpected. Even if you look at his most recent speech at the World Russian People's Assembly, and the World Russian People's Assembly is the largest church state platform for the church intellectuals to develop their ideological statements. And it is presided by Patriarch Kirill himself. And Putin said literally the following. He said that the most important principles of our policy should be observation of sovereignty and justice for the purpose of liberating the world from Western hegemony. So he is mentioning sovereignty and justice. And in this religious gathering, he is not mentioning the church, he is not mentioning morality, he is not mentioning faith in God, and so on and so forth. So he has definitely a different kind of agenda, which is only slightly influenced by the church. But also when it comes to some practical issues like LGBT persecution, well, yes, of course, but simultaneously you have cases when the state is putting to trial activists who are attacking LGBT people. So these cases are not very numerous, but they are. It's not completely unthinkable that the state is actually cracking down on those who are attacking LGBT activists. The same with abortions. You have, as I mentioned, these religious discourses against the abortion, and then you have one of the most liberal legislation about abortions. So it's the role of the church could be described as yes, but. In other way, it could be described as the attempt to be relevant and important, but the presence of the actual limitations.
And how have the church and state moved on parallel tracks towards a similar ideological conceptualizations then, especially regarding the concept of fundamental values?
Yeah, it was between 2009, 2014 approximately, when both sides, the church and the state, adopted this communitarian understanding that you don't have universal values, but only civilization-specific values.
And obviously, major deal then is how has the underdevelopment of Russian nationalism and the conceptualizations of the we community influenced the use of terms such as common core values, common historical identity, mission, and destiny.
It should be conceptualized on a philosophical level. So whenever you are trying to describe your community, and any ideology is basically about describing your community, right? Telling the story who you are. You can describe it in two ways. You can describe it who you are by setting your borders, like the community of Russians, this is the territory and the people who live here or there. But then you have several instances when it becomes unclear where Russia starts and where it ends. As you know, Putin himself half-jokingly said that Russia ends nowhere. You have also this popular among Russians joke that with whom Russia borders, with whom it wants. So when you don't know where your country actually ends, so how can you grasp who you are? There is still one way how to grasp who you are, by looking back in history and saying that you are those who were fighting with Mongols at Kulikovo field, for example. You are those who were fighting against Napoleon on the Borodino field. You are those who were fighting against Hitler, and so on and so forth. So you can refer to your community by tracing its historical genealogy and arguing that you are the same nation. Which is completely untrue from the viewpoint of liberal understanding of the things.
And the last question to finish, and not, of course, in a very pessimistic style as we are used to in this podcast, what are the implications of potential radicalization of Putinism in either social democratic or orthodox fundamentalist direction? How might this path affect Russia's domestic and foreign policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that religious fundamentalism is coming up in Russia. I don't see it inside. What I can see is the slight, not actually very probable, but slight possibility of radical nationalization, which can happen in case if Russia loses the war in Ukraine. And this can actually be fraught with a lot of destructive and illiberal potential. So think about interwar Germany. The most likely way how Putinism can be radicalized, however, is on the way of its incorporating left-wing ideas. So if it becomes the beacon of this conservative left-wing international, on this way, Putinism can become actually a major political force in the world.
Incredibly interesting. Everyone on Spotify and other means, Putinism, Post-Soviet Russian Regime Ideology by Professor Mikhail Suslov, the book to take on your shelves and read as soon as possible. Very interesting book. Highly recommend it. And thank you very much for a great conversation. We are now off. And best wishes for the upcoming new year and all the celebrations to everybody. Thank you.